iHeart launches Ruby, the latest from podnews.net with supporting cast where you own the listener relationship. iHeart Media launched Ruby, a branded podcast unit that's already working with QuickBooks and IBM. The company claims it's the first dedicated team of its kind from a major media company, though we're not sure Pacific Content or VoiceWorks would agree with that. In any case, last week, SMI said that US spending on branded podcasts was up 51% year-on-year in Q1. The podcast show takes place next week in London, and the show has announced a number of new speakers. Included are Acast CEO Ross Adams, Will Pearson from iHeart Podcasts, focusing on debunking the biggest myths in podcasting, and Ashley Flowers of true crime sensation Crime Junkie. I'll be there too, and you can use the code PODNEWS for a discount. UK podcast producer Fresh Air has been named as one of the best small companies to work in the UK by the Sunday Times. Neil Cowling tells Pod News, "I honestly couldn't be prouder of this." Did you know that Apple iPhone now offers live captions for any podcast you want to listen to? If your phone uses English in the US or Canada, you're good to go. Live captions are also available on Android phones and any audio you listen to on Chrome, on Windows, Mac OS, Linux and Android. We've updated our guide on how to get them. ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia has signed a representation deal with Producy, a podcast publisher. A conference focused on branded podcasts is on right now in Milan in Italy. It's called Give Your Brand a Voice and run by the OBE Podcast Committee. The conference includes speakers from Sky, Campari, Spotify Italy and Podnews. The podcast host writes a look at the podcast industry in Africa, and do you have a permit for that podcast studio? There might be more podcast studios in Arlington in Virginia after a new zoning proposal would allow them in offices without a permit. It's a good job we've all got them, isn't it? In People News, Candice Lim is joining Slate this week as the new co-host of Slate's Internet Culture podcast, In Case You Missed It. She guest-hosted an episode in February. Seb Rennie, who was hired by SCA in February as executive head of Listener Commercial, is to be the company's new chief commercial officer, it's been announced. And Kaylee Nave is one of 8 PRX staffers laid off. The rounds of layoffs is due to a decline in podcast sponsorship revenue felt across the industry, the company says. Time for some tech stuff, and the Podcasting 2.0 podcast played a song by Rusty Gate in Friday's episode, instantly catapulting the group to the #1 slot in music player Wavelake. The technology allows money to automatically flow through to music artists while their song is playing. Adam Curry reckons it's not just a technical thing.
You know, and I'm not trying to pick on Pod News Weekly Review, but this is so much bigger than a technical thing. It's cool that we had a technical implementation. It's much bigger than that. We are now circumventing an entire industry that's been in place for 60, 70 years.
That's us told. Now, with the podcast namespace, neither chapters or transcripts appear to work well with shows with dynamic ad insertion, particularly programmatic. In a blog post, Nathan Gathright takes us through the options we have available to us to fix that. And Crowdcast is a new AI project that turns a subreddit into its own podcast. We link to an AI-generated daily trivia podcast as well today, and a daily show about AI made by AI. Meanwhile, Spotify is throwing out AI-made songs and banning bot farms listening to them. And in podcast news, launching today, Scamander is the newest podcast from Lionsgate Sounds. The non-fiction limited series unravels the surprising and bizarre story behind Amanda C. Riley's long-running scam to use her growing online presence to take advantage of the social media community. New today from the BBC World Service and BBC News, Fukushima is a 7-part audio drama series exploring the 2011 nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan. Simon Pitts, who's commissioning editor of the BBC World Service in English, said that Fukushima is a compelling drama that powerfully explores the 2011 disaster. And behind the Rolling Stone cover, launched last week from the Australian and New Zealand edition of the magazine, it sees Rolling Stone editor-in-chief and regular Today Show contributor Poppy Reid reading the magazine's latest cover story in full, alongside exclusive commentary. Episode 1 has got Amy Shark on it. She joins Poppy Reid later in the podcast to delve behind the scenes of the cover story and photo shoot. This podcast is sponsored by Supporting Cast. Don't sell a Patreon, sell your own subscription. Supporting Cast is completely white labelled, so your brand is always front and centre. With Supporting Cast, you own the listener relationship. You can learn more at supportingcast.fm. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.